I'm in a good mood today. Yeah, how are you guys feeling today? Good, psyched? Okay, the rest of the morning I'm going to preach a sermon. It will change your lives. And then near the end of it, I'm going to have my friend Gene and his wife Minori. They're going to come and share about their mission in Japan and the training they do in Asia. And so right before they come, I'm going to give everyone who's getting baptized a warning. And that's when you can go change and come back and get ready and get your snorkel fit, get everything set. And then we'll come back, and after Gene's done sharing, we'll baptize people, sing another song, get out of here. Sound good? Think back to a time in your life when you felt extremely sad. You know, maybe it's somebody you lost. I think we've all been touched by death in this room. My mom passed 2 years ago. I've lost friends along the way who died too young. Maybe it's a dream you had, like you thought your life was going to play out a certain way and it just didn't happen. And so you lost what you thought your life was going to be. Or maybe it's just your innocence. Maybe somebody hurt you, did something bad to you, and it stole a piece from you haven't gotten back yet. Or it could be a marriage that's either struggling or actually died. Just imagine being in that place of sadness and that place of loss. You know, a lot of times when that happens, you just want to be alone, right? You just want to withdraw. You just want to catch your breath. You just want to settle for a little bit. Imagine you go to wherever it would be where you go to settle, and you go to just kind of reorient yourself in this new crazy world. You know, maybe you come here to the church in the sanctuary to spend some time in prayer. Maybe you go out into nature in the woods and you feel close to God out there. You know, maybe you got like a man cave or something you go into, and you turn on John Wick and Rage Against the Machine, and you just go into your quiet place. You know, whatever that spot is you go to, imagine you finally get there, you settle in, you go to rest, and you just want the space, and you want to start feeling all the pain and going through what you're supposed to go through, and then you hear a knock on the door. Or on the tree behind you if you're in the woods, you know. And you think, ah. So you get up, you turn, you open the door, and there's thousands of people there. Say, hey, I know it's your day off, but we really need your help. Okay, that's where Jesus is at when this story begins. You know, when we read the story here in Matthew chapter 14, what happens is Jesus' cousin and a close friend of his named John the Baptist gets murdered. An ancient Middle Eastern sheik, a king, executes him for no good reason. And it says, as soon as Jesus heard the news that John the Baptist had been murdered, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was headed and followed on foot from many towns. So he leaves on a boat, so people aren't going to swim after him. He comes back to shore, and Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So people came from all the surrounding towns out to this desolate place to come see Jesus out in the desert somewhere next to a lake. And at the end of the story, you find out that there were 5,000 men plus their families there. That's a huge crowd, right? Like, what do we have in here? 175, 200 people, something like that? Imagine, I don't know what, 10, 15, 20,000 people? And here's how I would react to the situation. I'd open the door, I'd see all the people, I'd say, Lord bless you. Slam the door. Like, I need my self-care time. I need my me time, you know? I need to recenter. I just wouldn't, that'd be the worst possible time for me to clock back on. But Jesus' sorrow over somebody who was really important to him. You know, I mentioned it was his cousin and that they agreed on a lot of things and they were important to each other. Jesus, who we believe is God, right? Jesus is God. Jesus is the Son of God. How does that work? I don't know, but it's true. And so Jesus, he said that John the Baptist was the greatest person who ever lived. In another part in the Bible, he says, no one has ever been born of a woman that's greater than John the Baptist. So when God gives you props, God has given him respect. So you know John the Baptist is super important to Jesus, and then he gets murdered. And you know, it's hard when you lose somebody when the time is right, isn't it? like when they're old and they've lived a good life and it's time to say goodbye and the rhythm is right. It's still sad, but the timing's right. It's harder when they die when the timing's wrong. Right? Like John the Baptist wasn't old, he was young. He was younger than I am now. And it's even harder when they die in a sudden and violent way like John the Baptist did. And so, some of you counselors in the room, or some of you people, first responders who have experienced trauma, if the death happens out of time and the more violent it happens, the more possibility it has to be traumatic for you. And so Jesus he's sorrowful. But he takes his sorrow and somehow he sees the crowd and he expands that sorrow for himself, for John the Baptist, for the whole situation. And his heart's so big, it just enfolds everybody who's waiting there who needs help. My heart's a little smaller than that. So here's the limits of my sorrow, okay? If I leave the house already frustrated, I don't think of the person driving slow in front of me as a precious child of God, and I don't wish their day would go as best as it possibly could because I just want good things for them. You know what I think? I think there's a reason it's called the passing lane, you moron. If you're going to drive slow, they have a lane for that. If you're not passing anyone, get over so I can pass you. You're costing me at least 20 seconds on my life. Unless we meet at the red light, then it didn't cost me anything, but maybe 20 seconds. Do you have any idea how important this is? And I'm just going to go get a Whopper or something, But it doesn't stop me from losing my mind. So that's kind of the limits of Kenji's heart. It's small. Hopefully it'll grow 3 sizes this Christmas. But it's pretty small. But Jesus is so loving and he's so compassionate when he turns in this place where he needs to grieve. He sees this huge crowd and he says he has compassion for them. His guts just wrench. He really feels for this group of people. So what does he do next? Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat and he had compassion on them and he healed their sick. Now, I don't know the math, but let's say there's 15, 20,000 people here. That's the crowd we're supposed to imagine. How many sick people are there? Like if you're going to travel all the way from home and walk, like you're not catching the train or the bus or the plane or driving, right? This is 2,000 years ago in the Middle East. You're walking in your sandals in the heat of the day. That's how you get everywhere as you walk. So they walk all this way from the town. I don't know how many of those people walked hoping just to hear Jesus give a speech, or how many people went through all that effort because they had somebody who was sick in their family. I don't know. I'm guessing there were a lot of sick people there. And Jesus healed all their sick. How long do you think it would take? Some of you are in the medical field. How many patients can you see a day? How long do you think it would take to go through 15, 20,000 people who brought their sick? So Jesus does this, and it takes all day. So it's evening. And the next verse says, that evening the disciples came to Jesus and said, this is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to villages and buy food for themselves. This makes total sense. Doesn't it? I mean, they're not being lazy. They're close to Jesus. They live with Jesus. They talk with Jesus. They joke with Jesus. They eat food with Jesus. They're always with Jesus. They're close to Jesus. And as they're close to Jesus, they get his heart a little bit and they see all these people and they care for all these people and they think, man, most of these people were hungry when they got here. You know how in our culture, our problem is we're all too fat? That's a new thing in the world. You guys know that, right? That's a new thing in the world, that our issue is having too much food. For almost everybody throughout almost all of history, as well as for a lot of people today, but for most everybody, most of history, the problem was not having enough food. So a lot of people were hungry a lot of the time. In fact, in Jesus' day, I've shared this before, but historians tell us about 70% of the population around Jesus' time didn't know where the next meal was coming from. 70%, that's a lot. I remember I was hiking in Peru, and I was talking to some of the guys there. Those guys are short. Those little Quechua dudes. They're like this tall, and then they carry these packs that are like 3 times their size. Talk about crazy. We're Americans like walking through. I feel pretty good because I hike, and these little dudes come by with the packs on, and they're wearing sandals. Seriously, they got chanclas on, and they're running through the mountains. And so what they would do is they would run past you so they had time to set up lunch. So when you got there, you could eat and the food was ready. And then you'd leave and they'd pack everything up and then they'd run past you and beat you so they could set up dinner. These dudes were, anyway, I was talking to one of them. And he talked about how it affects their kids when they don't have enough food. And he said it's not good when they don't get enough food because it makes them too short, makes them too small. I didn't know that. I mean, it makes sense when they mention it, but they knew firsthand what it was like to have one of your own children starve a little bit. And that was most of the ancient world. So most of these people who went out to see Jesus, a lot of them were hungry when they got there. So the disciples care about them, and it makes sense, right? Why don't you send them away so they have time before night, because it's already getting late. They can get to town, they can get some food, everybody will be okay. I think it's a good idea, don't you? It's weird, though, when you make suggestions to God, he has a habit of messing with you. Right? So here's Jesus' response. I'll read it again. That evening, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "That's not necessary. You feed them." And then their response is, "But we have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. Now, we're not talking like, you know those tunas that people haul in when they're deep sea fishing, it's like 1,000 pounds? That's not the 2 fish we're talking about. We're talking about these little fish they get from the Sea of Galilee. So they have 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. And loaves of bread, we're not talking about, well, you get it. Well, even if they were big, it's not enough to feed 15, 20,000 people, right? Let's say you came to church today and I said, "Hey, Emmett, you mind running the potluck today? It starts in 10 minutes, thanks." Then I leave. And was like, right? That's what Jesus just did to these guys. He's like, "Well, you feed them, no problem." They said, "Well, we only got a little bread and a little fish." So they bring this Lunchable to Jesus, and here's what Jesus says. Jesus says, "Bring them here." Then he told the people to sit down on the grass. Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up toward heaven, and blessed them. He just praised God, and he thanked God for the situation. That's not what I usually do when I don't have enough for my task. I just think, "God, why are you doing this to me? You called me to do this. Now you set me up for failure. Don't you know the details of my life?" Yeah, I'm an idiot. Then it says, "Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to the disciples who distributed it to the people." Everybody, 5,000 men plus the women and children, they all ate as much as they wanted, which we do almost every meal, which they almost never got to do. See, when you don't know where your next meal comes from, you got to spread the food out, and you usually leave the table hungry, not full. Like in Jesus' day, they ate very little meat just because they didn't have it. I mean, they weren't vegetarians because, they were Christian, but that's a joke. It's a joke. It's a joke rooted in truth, but it's still a joke. But, actually, it's funny. I think I shared this before, but I was reading a book about the Mongolians and the Great Horde, that spread out across Asia and conquered most of Europe as well. And it says the Mongolians decided to be Christians instead of Buddhists or Muslims. And the reason was because Buddhists didn't eat meat and Muslims couldn't drink. And Christians could do both. So they decided to go with Christianity as they were slaughtering everyone who lived on the planet. What am I even talking about? Oh yeah, but in that world, they ate as much as they wanted, so they got full. It was important enough to point it out that they got to eat as much as they wanted at this meal. Everybody was full, and after that, there's 12 basketfuls of food left over. And you think, well, I think if I was a disciple, put yourself in their shoe. I'm like, well, Jesus, we don't have enough. What do we do? And he says, well, bring it here. The little we have, we put in his hands. And then he looks up and he starts breaking the bread, handing it to us. We take it with our hands. We go and we hand it out to people. The first half hour, maybe 2 hours would have been awesome. Because you're like, where's all this bread coming from? Where's all this fish coming from? It'd be amazing just watching this miracle unfold, right? This is a miracle that happened. Like it wasn't enough food, and it was enough food. That's weird. And so Jesus does this miracle, and he's handing out all this food, and the disciples were probably psyched for maybe, the first 400 people? They had to serve everybody. I think the miracle would have gotten old around 10,005 people. Like just hours. In the beginning, it's like, you're handing out the food. This is amazing. This is amazing. I'm like, take your bread. Take your bread. This sucks. It's like the first snowfall. It's so beautiful. We go out and shovel it, On the third work, we're like, I hate the snow. It was like that. It just kept wearing on and on and on and on. Here's a good question I want to ask you guys. If Jesus was so nice like this story talks about, he's pretty harmless, right? Like he just feeds people. He heals people. He has compassion on people. He loves people. And this is a Jesus we know, right? Love one another, love your enemies, forgive, just as the Lord forgave you. There's all kinds of things that are beautiful. If Jesus was just a nice guy, how come he ended up getting murdered? Good question, right? Like, you don't just murder nice people. They die in their old age because everyone likes them. So you think, how did Jesus get to the point where he actually got murdered? Because that's basically what happened. He dies on a cross. And the cross was a form of execution in ancient times. So it's kind of like our electric chair. But just imagine when we took people to the electric chair for a terrible crime they committed, if we did that in plain view of the whole world, and if we tortured them as long as possible so they could be in anguish as long as possible before they died, so the whole world knew not to mess with us. That's what the cross was. It was an instrument of government torture and execution that was only reserved for the worst criminals. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen, you couldn't be crucified because it was considered beneath your dignity. And the pain of crucifixion, because what happens is you end up suffocating to death usually over days. But the pain and the torture of crucifixion was so terrible that we have a word that describes it. Excruciating. Ex-crux. Excruciating means out of the cross. So the pain of being crucified was so terrible, we made up a new word to describe it. That the pain of it was excruciating. And so Jesus goes through this and he gets executed by the Roman government. What, for being a nice guy? For healing some people? For saying love one another? What's the big deal? Well, it turns out there's a reason Jesus is out in the wilderness in the first place. You see, John the Baptist taught a lot of similar things that Jesus taught. And he had just gotten murdered by a government official. And so Jesus goes out to the wilderness. He knows he's going to die eventually, but he also knows the timing isn't right. And so he's moving the chess pieces around so everything works out like it's supposed to. There's a historical reason why Jesus got crucified, and then there's a theological and philosophical reason. We're going to talk about them both real quick, right? Okay, so historically, the reason Jesus got crucified is because he was threatening the power structure of the people who were in charge at the time, and they didn't like what he was doing, so they did some political maneuvering, so Jesus got killed. So, I'll just do one example, because this isn't like a historical lecture or anything. I'm sure he's grateful for that. For example, during that day, there was this elite political and priestly class. You guys don't know this because we don't have an elite political class that's untouchable in our society, but pretend like that exists, right? Pretend like that's a thing. So there was this elite political and priestly class in the ancient world, and they had a lot of power and a lot of social influence, and then there was all these peasants and everyone else who had none. And in the ancient world, you couldn't really work your way up from just some person up to this political class. The station you were born into life that you were stuck in, for the most part. And so this political class, which basically wasn't touchable, for example, the king that executed John the Baptist, the reason he did it is because he got wasted at a party he was having. One of his relatives danced for him. He liked her dance so much he promised her anything she wanted. She said she wanted this guy's head on a platter, so he sent orders to go cut this guy's head off and give it to her on a platter. That's an untouchable priestly political class, right? Like they could do whatever they wanted, and they often did. So this is the world they live in. Well, a lot of these powerful people didn't like Jesus because he started saying things like, you know that big temple, that big building? You know all those priests? And you know how usually you have to go to the temple and you have to go through the priests to talk to God, right? He said, nah, those days are over. You get to talk to God directly by yourself. You don't need the temple. You don't need the priests. In fact, someone greater than the temple is here. It's unnecessary. So what if your job is the guy working at the temple and you get this guy getting really, really, really famous, so famous that maybe 20,000 people will walk long distances to be with him, and they're listening to this guy say, you don't need the temple anymore. You think, well, got to fix that problem. And so what ended up happening is there were a lot of political behind-the-scenes movements, and they were able to arrest Jesus at a certain time, then have him executed. And you know what's crazy? The person that executed him, the Roman governor, his name is Pontius Pilate, he knew Jesus was innocent. He could see all the political maneuvers that were happening. But he just thought, you know what? I see all the political maneuvers that are happening. I know this guy's innocent, but honestly, it'd just be easier if I just executed him. So he sent Jesus off to be executed because he didn't want the headache. So historically, that's why Jesus got crucified. But Jesus knew he was going to be crucified. He predicts it several times in the Bible before it happens. Now, if I'm going to get crucified, you know what I do? I Google countries with no extradition to the U.S. And then I try and find a way to go there. I'll buy a really bad mustache. It would, of course, be Tom Selleck's mustache, right? Because why wouldn't you? And so I'd buy a really bad mustache, try and change my identity. I would live in one of these places. That's how I would roll. I'm realizing I'm not winning a lot of respect here. But that's not what Jesus did. The whole reason Jesus came, he said, was to die on the cross on purpose. In fact, he said, I'm laying down my life voluntarily so that people will see me die and they'll know that I died voluntarily. And you think, well, why? Why would he also choose to die before his time, violently, not at a full age, in the plain view of everyone to see? And that's when we get into the philosophical reason. Later in Matthew, they're going to have conversations about Jesus, him getting crucified. He's going to predict it. And it's so out of pocket, the disciples don't even know what he's talking about. They say, I'll get crucified on the third day I'll rise. And they're like, what? He says, I'm going to get crucified on the third day I'll rise. They say, huh? And then the third time he says, I'm going to get crucified the third day I'll rise. Like, what? Seriously, 3 times. Like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. Sounds bad. We're sad, but it just didn't make sense that Jesus would die on a cross because only the worst people died on a cross, and Jesus rose people from the dead. Once in a while somebody be dead, he was like, nah. And they're not dead anymore. So you're thinking, okay, how's this guy going to get arrested and die like some loser criminal? So they have all kinds of conversations about it, and Jesus explains why he's getting crucified as they have those conversations. They just didn't get it at the time. And here's how I'm going to break this down briefly. You read the Bible, you read the books of other religions, you hear people talk, you listen to podcasts, you read philosophers' books, and you hear everyone trying to explain how God feels about the world. Right? This is right, this is wrong, God's mad about this, God loves that. Like election season was crazy, wasn't it? If you're a Christian and you just block me right now. I was like, where's the fun in that? I'm going to troll instead, right? Because I'm a good person. No, I don't think so. But I have friends who can't conceive of how you could possibly be a Christian and whatever. And so everyone's talking about how God feels about everything, which to me says nobody really knows, because they're all saying the opposite things. And we all try and think, okay, I have a friend who's, what's this? I have a friend who's an atheist, and he says, squirrel, I have a friend who's an atheist, and he says you look on the universe, and there's darkness and blackness. Most of it's empty. It's vacuous death, and nothing can exist outside of this tiny little planet, which is a grain of sand on the outer side of the universe. It takes us about 230 or 50 million years to orbit the galaxy once, much more the galaxy orbiting the whole universe, because that's also spinning. We're around one star of billions and billions of stars in the universe. Most of the universe is emptiness and death, and you're telling me God exists? I said, yeah. But that's one perspective. And then another person looks on the same universe and says, and this is a non-Christian, by the way. And he says, think about this. In the vastness of the universe, there's one little grain of sand on the outer edge of it that takes 250 million years to circle its own galaxy as that galaxy is circling the whole universe. And on that one little pocket, there's this infinitely precious thing called consciousness. And so for some reason, something decided to deposit the most precious gift in this vast amount of space and time. And because it's so few, it makes it so beautiful and so infinitely worthy of attention and beauty and praise. Two opposite reactions, right? So we're just guessing at what God thinks. We're just guessing at what this life is all about. Wouldn't it be nice if God would just tell us? That's Jesus. Jesus, who was God, became a man, and he came down and he lived on the earth. Because we can't speak God, but God can speak human. And he didn't come just to teach about stuff. He came to show us love. Because you can say you love somebody. That's easy. That's cheap. Putting up with a crap for 40 years in our marriage, that proves something, right? That shows love. And so you can say you love somebody, but what he did is he became a human. And he walked in the dust and the dirt. And he healed people. And he cast out demons. And he raised people from the dead. And he listened to people's stupid ideas. And he watched people walk away sad because he asked them to follow him and they said no, because they loved the riches too much. He had all these experiences in life. And every time, what we see when we see Jesus is we see God, how he feels towards humans. And how does he feel? Does he feel, get out of the passing lane, you moron? That's not how God feels about us, and we learn this because of Jesus. And some of you grew up in a religious tradition that basically said God's really mad at you because you broke a bunch of rules. And maybe if you like Jesus enough, he won't send you to hell to burn forever. But he's still basically mad at you. Anybody ever hear that? Or get that impression? Yeah. Well, we see Jesus, and what does he do? He comes home, he's trying to get some time to himself, he sees all these people, and what does the heart of God do? He has compassion on everybody. He heals them. He spends all day with them, caring for them. And eventually he's going to make the ultimate sacrifice and show them just how much he loves them by dying on the cross. And showing that this world is ugly, sin is ugly, death is ugly, suffering is ugly, sorrow is ugly, pain is ugly, people who abuse the power, it's ugly, sickness is ugly, death itself is ugly. But the one we worship is greater than death, and he's overcome the grave. And he shows us on the cross, not only is this world an ugly place, but that God's love reaches into all the ugliness, it reaches through it, and it makes everything good again, and makes it beautiful again. And I'm telling you, the world is trying to convince you that you're just another speck of dust on the planet, another speck of dust in the universe, that you're not lovely or lovable, and that you're not worthy. But Jesus says the opposite. Jesus says you're worth so much that I'll become a man, I'll walk, I'll put up with people, I'll stay up late, I'll heal all the sick, and I'll even go to the cross and die because I want you to know that the measure of love that I have for you as God is infinite. And that's why Jesus goes to the cross voluntarily. It's because he has to say as clearly as possible, because we have a hard time getting this, that he loves you. That he wants you to exist. That he chose the time and place that you exist, that you're here on purpose, and that he's glad you exist and that you're alive. So here's how I want to wrap this up real quick. Before you leave, I'll give you kind of a game plan for your life so you can figure out how you can live close with God. Good news is you don't need a temple. You don't need a priest. I don't need to be your pastor. You don't have to tithe 10%. You don't have to memorize 1,000,000 Bible verses. You are supposed to have a direct relationship with God, you and him directly, not through anybody else. And so here's how it happens. 4 principles from this passage real quick. We're going to run through this. The first one is, with your feet, I want you to walk close to Jesus. Because see, that's what the disciples are doing. When Jesus is out there and he comes back and he sees everybody there, the disciples are close to Jesus. They get a little bit of the heart of Jesus and they care about people. And so I want you to walk closely with God. And some of us, we walk far from God. Then when the poop hits the fan, we run back to God until it gets cleaned up. And then we kind of just start drifting again. And so God isn't really our God. He's kind of like a dictionary on a shelf. And when you come up against a word in life you don't know the definition for, you look it up, you figure it out, then you put it away and you take off. But that's not a God. That's a dictionary, right? So I want you to continually, every day, walk close to God. How do you do that? There's a million ways, but I want you to enjoy God. Every day, it is your obligation to delight yourself in the Lord. I want you to enjoy the Lord. I want you to try and enjoy the Lord. You won't enjoy him every day because sometimes you're just not in the mood, you're not feeling it, whatever. But I want you to consciously every day think about how you can be walking with God that day. It'll be different for everybody. One thing that helps a lot of people is when they sit in a quiet place and they read the Bible a little bit and they pray a little bit. Other people, they like helping other people. So if you help somebody else, you feel close to God. Some people do like nature. If you're coming to church, whatever that day, just take a couple minutes at the beginning of the day and say, okay, today, what would it look like for me to walk closely with God? Just pray about it for 5 or 10 minutes. When you start every single day, then every day just walk close to the Lord. So that's the first thing. The second thing is with your mouth, I want you to give God all your ideas. They said, hey, it's getting late. We should send everybody home. Now here's a caveat. Your ideas are probably really dumb. God's just smarter than us. Can we agree on that? Which means the likeliness of my plan being his plan is very low. And the longer I'm a Christian, the more I realize that I make all these plans just for fun, and the Lord is like, oh, kiddo. Good job, little buddy. Right? So make your plans if it makes you feel better. We all need a hobby. But the main thing is I want you to talk to God and just share your ideas with him. Just share your plans with them, knowing that you'll probably veto them and they'll look a lot different than you think. And see, there's a huge difference here because usually what we do is we take our plans and then we go to God and we ask God to baptize the plans we already have. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you share your plans with him, you watch him absolutely demolish those, and then you take yourself and you get baptized. So it's different than having your own plan and saying, God, okay, now do this in a way that I like. You want to say instead, God, what's the plan? What does obedience look like for me? Okay, so first, with your feet, walk closely with God. With your mouth, share all your ideas with him. And then with your ears, just like them, I want you to hear the voice of God and I want you to find out his plan for you. They said, hey, we should send all these people home. That's the plan. That way they can eat. And then Jesus says what? That's not necessary. You feed them. Like, don't think I heard you right. They heard him right. So I want you to hear from God too. Now, how do you know you're hearing from God and not the pizza you ate last night? Right? How do you know you're hearing from God not being a crazy person? This is also different for everybody, but I'll give you kind of a quick idea. I know people who say when they pray, they audibly hear God's voice. Like they hear God talk to them. I think that'd be awesome. I don't think that's ever happened to me, ever. Now, I've heard God's voice, but it hasn't been like, Kenji, behold. I've never gotten that before. But something really important for learning how to hear God's voice is you need to learn to be still and to still all the craziness and the hyperactivity you have within yourself and the storm that's inside. And I just want you to, in that stillness, I want you to try and hear God. And God usually speaks to us through our own thoughts. But you know how your thoughts have different tones? You know what I'm saying? Like a trumpet sounds different than a piano. They might both be hitting a C note, but you can tell the difference between the instruments, right? Or once I was riding a car and my kids were watching a portable DVD player, because that's how old I am. And I wasn't watching the screen, but I could tell which character was speaking just by the sound of the voice, right? So your thoughts have different voices too. If it's anxious, if it's nervous, if it's uncertain, if it's weighing every option, that's probably you, because you're probably an anxious wreck usually. That's probably your voice. If it sounds like a bully, oh, you gotta do this. And it feels real urgent. Or if it's real seductive, hey, just no one's gonna know. I mean, you deserve this. It'll be okay. Or if it goes after your weakness. Like we all got besetting sins, and Satan knows the buttons to push. So if it goes right after your weakness, that's probably Satan. So if it's a bully, if it's a seductress, or if it's a general, like strategically going after weakness, that's probably Satan. This should be a whole sermon by itself, but you guys are taking notes. You're good. When the voice is calm and it sounds like it's in charge, and it brings a lot of peace, not pleasure. When it brings a lot of peace, it's different. When it brings a lot of peace, that's probably the voice of God. So sit down and talk to God, and he'll talk to you through your own thoughts, and you just kind of figure out what those voices are. And when you hear the voice of God, obey it. Now, if it's something crazy, because sometimes God asks us to do crazy things, right? You'll see when my friend Gene comes up here. He's a white boy. And he lives in Japan. That's unusual, okay? God asks us to do weird things all the time. They came to him, the disciples came to Jesus with food, and he said, you feed everybody. They said, what? He says crazy stuff sometimes. So it's not a bad idea to have mature Christians in your life you can bounce those ideas off of just to make sure you're not actually being a crazy person, okay? Second line of defense, that's a good idea. Okay, so here's what we got. With your feet, I want you to walk close with God every day. And just when you wake up in the morning, think, okay, what would it look like for me to walk closely with God today? How can I enjoy the Lord today? Then with your mouth, I want you to share all your ideas, all your thoughts, even your anger and your doubts, your frustrations with God. You can share those with God. He's a big boy. He can take it. And then with your ears, I want you to hear what God is telling you to do. Prayer is not just speaking, it's also listening, right? Imagine, you guys have all had those friends, they just talk the whole time and you never get a turn. You just can't wait to get out of there. Don't be that guy, right? So with your ears, you want to listen, and then with your hands, you want to do whatever God has commanded you to do. What good is it if you get direction from God if you're disobedient after you get the direction? That's what the Christian life is about. It's about surrender. And really listening to God's voice and following God's voice and obeying it yourself. And honestly, for me, this is my biggest problem with God, is he wants to have his way in my life, and I want to have my way in my life. And that's where we butt heads, because I'm a stubborn, independent person, and there's things I want. And so that's kind of where we butt heads. But you do want to get in the habit of surrender. And for most of us, we've organized our lives apart from God. We haven't really walked closely with God. And then there's points in our lives where we decide again, you know what, I'm going to surrender afresh this time. I'm going to surrender everything. I'm going to let go. And it's kind of like this. Everyone hold your hands out like this real quick. Okay, I'm going to do 3 tests with you. Ready? Put your fingers like this. And I want you to do a circle forward. Good job. Okay, now do a circle backward. Nice. Some of you are too cool for this. I can see that. I respect it. Now I want you to go both directions. Come on, hurry up. Double day. Hey, Regan's got it. Nice work. He lost it right after I told him he got it. Okay. Oh, someone just lost an eye over here. Okay, here's the actual thing I want you to do. Put your hands out like this. And now imagine everything that's really important to you in these hands. Like I remember when I became a new father, I held my daughter Hope in my hands and she was so tiny. She was so tiny. And she was smaller the second day because they lose weight. She was so little. Just take whatever is precious to you and put them in your hands and now grip them as hard as you can. Now, when the Lord wants to give you something new, how much can you receive when your fists are clenched? How much can he put in your hands when you go through life like this? And so we walk through hands with clenched fists and we wonder why God doesn't bless us. So there's times in our life where we just need to let it go. We need to open our hands. We need to surrender. And we need to say, Lord, this isn't about my plans and you making my plans work. It's about me surrendering not just my ideas, but myself to you, so that I can receive whatever you want to put in my hands. And whenever you take the little you have, even if it's just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and you put it in the hands of the Lord, he can do great things with it. And most of us, it's so sad because we live lives absorbed by ourselves. And a lot of people go through all of life and they die that way. But when we get the joy of knowing that we don't just live for ourselves, but there's other people in the world, and we're here to bless them as well, then a lot of the anxieties that we ball up about ourselves, those disappear and they dissipate. And we find the meaning of life. And this can happen when you're 12 years old, and it can happen when you're 120. Doesn't matter. Every new day is a day God has given you on purpose. And if you've gotten a new day, that's a day to surrender. And it's a day to pursue the joy of the Lord, to listen to what he has for you, and then to do what he says. So we have some people who are going to surrender today. One symbol of surrender is baptism. And when you go in the water, that's a symbol of a couple things. One, it's a symbol of you dying to your old life. Then when you come out of the water, it's a symbol that you're going to live a new life for God. It's also a symbol that you're getting washed and you're being purified. And like all the sin and all the hurt from before, that God's love is covering that up and you're being made new. And you're not just saved from hell or from a terrible life or from sin, but you're saved to this new life of holiness and calling and obedience and surrender. So we have some people getting dunked today. And like usual, it's a huge decision. And so when these people get baptized, you should lose your minds. Right? That's the appropriate response. No golf clapping allowed. You should be really happy about this because it's a big, big deal. I want to pray for us. I want to pray a prayer of surrender. I don't know where you're at with God. It doesn't have to go through me. But I want you to leave closer with God today than you came here. And I want you to start walking closely with him with your feet and sharing your life with him with your mouth and hearing his voice and obeying what he says. So everyone, let's put our hands out one more time. Close our eyes and pray. Lord Jesus, we just want to give you ourselves. We want to surrender. We want to follow you. And now picture whatever you've been holding on to in your hands, whatever you think you need, whatever you're desperate for. And when you're ready, we all have our eyes closed, nobody's watching. Just want you to open your hands and let those things go so that you're in a place of surrender where you can receive from the Lord. Lord God, I pray your blessing upon everyone in this room. I pray that all the men and the women and children here would be close to you in this miraculous moment. That you've ordained we be in this room at this moment to hear your word. Lord, we give you ourselves, all our hopes and dreams, all of our hurts and our griefs. We thank you for loving us and for showing us that by dying on the cross. And so, Lord, in return, we give you ourselves. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.